On the morning of the 6th of November 1956, the British cabinet was sitting in Downing Street when a message arrived for the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Harold Macmillan had spent the previous days trying to get his hands on money. Britain's gold and dollar reserves were draining out at a speed nobody in the room had seen before, and there was an obvious place to go. Britain was a founding member of the International Monetary Fund. It had paid in a quota. Part of that quota, it was entitled to draw on more or less automatically, the way you draw on your own deposit. By Macmillan's own account, he telephoned New York, and New York referred him to Washington. And while the cabinet sat, the reply came back. The United States government would not agree to the technical procedure until Britain had agreed to a ceasefire. Not a loan, not aid, the technical procedure. Britain was being told it could not access its own position at the fund until it stopped shooting. That afternoon, with British paratroopers holding an airfield in Egypt and the armored column moving down the canal, and with the military assessment being that the whole waterway could be taken inside a day, the British government announced a ceasefire. It did not warn the French. It did not warn the Israelis. There were no American troops involved at any point. There was no blockade, no ultimatum delivered by an ambassador, no threat of force of any kind. What happened was that one large holder of sterling assets indicated it might sell, and one line of credit was not extended. 6 weeks later, the last British soldier left Egypt. Inside 2 months, the Prime Minister had resigned, and the largest empire in human history had, in a way that is genuinely difficult to overstate, discovered the limits of its own sovereignty. So this is a story about how a currency becomes a leash. And to understand why the threat worked in November 1956, you have to understand what Britain had been carrying since 1945, because the vulnerability was not created by Suez. It was created by the war, and Suez simply demonstrated it. Start with the pound, because the pound is the thing that is actually at stake here, not the canal. For most of the 19th century and into the 20th, sterling was the world's money. International trade was invoiced in it. Central banks held reserves in it. The City of London provided the shipping insurance and the trade credit and the settlement, and the pound was the unit all of it was denominated in. That arrangement was the actual mechanism of British power, far more than any garrison. By 1956, that role had shrunk, but it had not ended, and the way it had not ended was dangerous. There was a thing called the sterling area. It was a monetary bloc, formalized during the Second World War, made up of the Commonwealth, the colonies, and a set of associated territories, plus a handful of others. Members pegged their currencies to the pound. They held their official reserves in sterling in London rather than in gold or dollars at home, and their dollar earnings were pooled centrally, which meant that when Malayan rubber or Ghanaian cocoa or Australian wool earned hard currency, that hard currency went into a common pool in London. Britain was, functionally, the banker for a quarter of the world. Now look at the balance sheet of that bank, because it is terrifying. At the end of 1945, the sterling liabilities of the United Kingdom, the balances that other countries and territories held in London and could in principle claim, came to around £3.7 billion. Britain's gold and dollar reserves at that moment stood at about £620 million. The liabilities were roughly 6 times the reserves. Those balances were not deposits anyone had chosen to make. They were largely war debts. When Britain fought the war, it bought supplies across the empire, from Indian textiles and Egyptian cotton to food and labor and materials everywhere, and it paid for a great deal of it by crediting an account in London rather than sending gold. India was owed enormous sums this way. So was Egypt. Britain came out of the war having won it and having converted itself from the world's largest creditor into one of the world's largest debtors, with the debts owed disproportionately to the countries it governed. By the mid-1950s, a decade of careful management had improved the ratio without changing the fundamental problem. American analysis at the time put foreign sterling balances at just under $10 billion against British reserves that were struggling to stay above $2 billion. That is the structure. It is a bank with maybe a fifth of its liabilities in liquid form, which is a perfectly normal way to run a bank right up until the moment when it isn't. And Britain already knew exactly how fast that moment arrives, because it had lived through it once. In 1945, with the war over and Lend-Lease terminated abruptly, Britain went to Washington for an emergency loan. The Americans provided $3.75 billion and attached a condition. Sterling was to be made fully convertible into dollars at a fixed rate by July 1947. That condition was designed to break open the sterling bloc and let American goods into imperial markets, and when convertibility was imposed on schedule, it did something rather more immediate. Holders of sterling did the obvious thing and converted. Reserves drained at a rate that made the arrangement untenable within weeks, and convertibility was suspended after about 5 weeks, having cost Britain roughly $1 billion. That was the rehearsal, 9 years before Suez. It had already been demonstrated that the sterling balances were not a stable deposit base, but a queue, waiting for a door to open, and that the man holding the door was in Washington. There was one further thing Britain could do, and it did it during the crisis itself, which turned out to be a serious mistake. When the fighting started, London blocked Egypt's sterling balances, freezing money Egypt held in British accounts. Look at that from the perspective of every other holder. India, Pakistan, Ghana, Malaya, and the rest were all keeping their national reserves in London, on the understanding that those reserves were theirs. In November 1956, they watched Britain freeze a member's balances the moment that member became politically inconvenient. Indian distrust of sterling is recorded as growing from precisely that moment. Britain had demonstrated the security of its own deposit base to its own depositors, and the demonstration did not go well. And there was a second constraint, which was the exchange rate. Under the Bretton Woods system, Britain had committed to defending the pound at $2.80 within a narrow band. Defending it meant that whenever the market pushed sterling toward the bottom of that band, the Bank of England had to stand there buying pounds with dollars out of the reserves, which means the reserves were not a rainy day fund. They were ammunition, and every day of a currency attack burned some. Then there's a detail which is small and turns out to be enormous. Britain published its reserve figure every month, not annually, not on request, every month a number in public. And there was a known psychological floor, a level around $2 billion that officials believed sterling could not be seen to fall below without the market concluding that devaluation was coming. So the position in 1956 was this: a currency the whole sterling area was holding on trust, backed by reserves that covered a fraction of the claims, defended at a fixed rate, with the ammunition count published monthly for anyone to read. It was not fragile because Britain was poor. British trade was actually fine. It was fragile because it was a confidence structure, and confidence structures fail in one direction very quickly. Now, why did anyone put up with that? Because there's a genuine question here about why Britain didn't simply devalue and be free of it. Two reasons, and both are about empire rather than economics. The first is that the sterling area was the last functioning imperial institution. The formal empire was going. India and Pakistan had gone in 1947, Burma and Ceylon in 1948. But the monetary bloc survived independence. Newly independent countries stayed in it, kept their reserves in London, and kept trading in pounds, and as long as that continued, Britain remained the center of something. The second is prestige, which sounds soft and was not. A reserve currency confers a specific privilege. Other people hold your money, which means you can run deficits they would fund, and it means London stays the place where the world's business is arranged. British officials believed, correctly, that if sterling stopped being a reserve currency, Britain would stop being a great power and become a medium-sized European economy. Macmillan rejected devaluation categorically. The governor of the Bank of England, Cameron Cobbold, rejected it even more strongly. And this is the crucial point about what happened later, because those two men had ruled out devaluing or floating. The only way to defend the rate was with reserves, and the only source of more reserves in a crisis was the United States. They had chosen, years before Suez, to make themselves dependent. Suez just presented the bill. Which brings us to the canal and to the man who decided to take it. Gamal Abdel Nasser had come to power in the aftermath of a 1952 coup that removed the Egyptian monarchy, and by 1954 he was the dominant figure in the country. He wanted two things above all. He wanted the British military presence in Egypt gone, and he wanted the high dam at Aswan built, because the dam meant power and irrigation and a modern economy. The Suez Canal ran through Egyptian territory, but it was operated by the Suez Canal Company, in which the British government held a major stake and French investors held most of the rest. It was the artery through which the oil of the Persian Gulf reached Europe. For Britain, it was not simply infrastructure. It was the physical link to what remained of an Eastern Empire. It is worth being concrete about what the canal carried, because the panic in London was not irrational. Something like a quarter of all British imports came through it. Around two-thirds of the oil consumed in Western Europe passed through it or arrived via the pipelines that ran from Iraq to the Mediterranean. The alternative route, around the Cape of Good Hope, added weeks to every voyage and a great deal of cost, and there were not enough tankers in the world to run that route at the volumes Europe needed. There was also the 99-year lease. The concession under which the company operated was due to expire in 1968, at which point the canal would have reverted to Egypt anyway. Nasser had, in effect, taken 12 years early, a thing that was already scheduled to be his, and he had offered to compensate shareholders at the market price of the stock. That detail matters for judging the reaction. Britain and France were not defending a permanent right. They were defending the last 12 years of an expiring concession, and they were prepared to go to war over it. The United States and Britain had agreed in late 1955 to help finance the Aswan Dam. Then Nasser bought weapons from the Soviet bloc through Czechoslovakia, and recognized Communist China in May of 1956, and Washington's enthusiasm evaporated. On the 19th of July, 1956, the United States withdrew the funding offer. Britain followed. A week later, on the 26th of July, Nasser gave a speech in Alexandria and announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company. He would use the tolls, he said, to build the dam himself. As he spoke, he used the name of Ferdinand de Lesseps, the canal's builder, as a prearranged signal, and Egyptian forces moved in and took control of the offices. The British reaction was immediate, and it was disproportionate, and understanding why matters. Anthony Eden had been Foreign Secretary during the appeasement of the 1930s, and had resigned over it, and he read Nasser through that lens. He and much of his cabinet genuinely believed that a dictator seizing an international asset had to be stopped early, or he would not be stopped at all. Eisenhower's read was different. He thought Nasser was within his rights to nationalize a company operating on Egyptian soil, provided compensation was paid, that Egypt was likely to keep the canal open because it needed the revenue, and above all, that a Western military attack on an Arab state would push the entire region toward Moscow. Through the autumn, he pressed for negotiation and international conferences. He was clear, repeatedly and in writing, that he opposed force, so Britain and France stopped telling him what they were planning. In late October at Sèvres, outside Paris, British, French, and Israeli representatives agreed a scheme. Israel would attack across Sinai. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum to both sides to withdraw from the canal zone, which Egypt could not accept because the canal was in Egypt, and would then intervene as separators of the combatants and take the canal. The plan required deceiving the United States, and it did. On the 29th of October, Israel invaded. The ultimatum followed. Anglo-French air operations began on the 31st. On the 5th of November, British paratroopers took the airfield at El Gamil, and French paratroopers landed at Port Fouad. The seaborne landings came the next morning, with Royal Marines going ashore by landing craft and, for the first time in history, by helicopter. Militarily, it was working. That is important to hold on to, because it is what makes the rest of the story what it is. Egyptian resistance was being brushed aside, and the column was moving down the canal. British commanders assessed that the entire waterway could be in their hands within 24 hours. They never got the 24 hours. And to see why, you have to look at what was happening to the pound, and to one other thing that Britain also could not produce for itself. Because there was a second dependency running alongside the financial one, and it was oil. Roughly 2/3 of Western Europe's oil came through the canal, or through the pipelines, crossing Syria from Iraq. Within days of the fighting starting, both were gone. The Egyptians scuttled ships in the canal and blocked it completely, and it would stay blocked for 5 months. Syrian engineers, acting in solidarity with Egypt, sabotaged the Iraq Petroleum Company pipeline pumping stations. So Britain went to war over a canal and immediately lost the use of it, along with the alternative route. There was a contingency for this. The Americans had established a Middle East Emergency Committee with a plan to redirect oil from the Western Hemisphere to Europe if supply from the region was interrupted, and that plan was ready to go. Eisenhower did not activate it. Through the whole of November, while Britain was burning reserves, defending a currency, and burning fuel it could not replace, the tankers did not sail. Where Britain introduced petrol rationing in December, and it lasted until May 1957. Hold that alongside the reserves, because it doubles the pressure. Britain needed dollars to defend the pound and needed dollars to buy oil on the open market at emergency prices. And each need made the other worse. The two dependencies were the same dependency wearing different clothes. The tap for both of them was in Washington. If you're finding this useful, subscribe, because this channel goes after the financial machinery underneath the events everyone thinks they already understand. Now, let's watch the reserves. The selling did not begin in November. It began in July. Reconstructions of Bank of England daily dealing records show that sterling started losing credibility almost immediately after the canal was nationalized, months before a single shot. The market could see what everyone could see. Britain was talking about a war in the Middle East. Wars cost dollars, the canal might close, and the oil route to Europe ran through it. Through the second half of 1956, the reserves declined steadily. There was one temporary reprieve in August when Britain sold the Trinidad Oil Company and booked around $177 million, which is the sort of thing you do when you're quietly running out of assets. In the third quarter, the loss was about $57 million, and would have been closer to $230 million without that sale. October cost $84 million. Then, November arrived. By the end of the month, Macmillan would tell the House of Commons that the reserves had fallen by $279 million, leaving them at $165 million. Read that second number again. The published floor, the level officials believed could not be breached without triggering an assumption of devaluation, was $2 billion. They had gone through it. Academic reconstruction of the daily records puts the true November loss even higher, above $400 million once all the intervention is counted. And an American assessment in late November records the reserves dropping by $102 million in a single week. This is a bank run, not a metaphorical one. Holders of sterling around the world were converting into dollars. The Bank of England was standing in the market buying pounds to hold the rate, and every pound it bought came out of a reserve that everyone could watch shrinking on a published schedule. Now here is what makes the American position so effective. And it is the part that gets flattened into a simple story about Eisenhower being angry. The United States did not have to attack the pound. The market was already doing that. All Washington had to do was decline to help, to make sure the British knew there was a further step available if declining wasn't enough. There were 3 levers, and they were used in ascending order of severity. The first was passive. The United States simply did not support sterling. It did not intervene, did not lend, did not arrange a swap. Given that Britain had ruled out devaluation, American inaction alone guaranteed that the reserves would run out on a calculable date. The second was the fund. Britain wanted to draw on the IMF, and the sums under discussion were large, over $500 million initially, with total stabilization needs running past $1 billion. The IMF is a multilateral institution, but American votes dominate it, and matters concerning it fell under the United States Treasury. Washington made clear that it would not support disbursement while military operations continued. That is the message that reached Macmillan on the morning of the 6th of November. The third lever was the one that was never actually pulled, and it is the one that ends the story. Eisenhower instructed his Treasury Secretary, George Humphrey, to prepare to sell part of the United States government's holdings of sterling bonds. Consider what that means mechanically. The United States held British government paper. If the largest and most visible holder of sterling assets in the world began publicly selling them in the middle of a run, every other holder would understand instantly that the American government had concluded sterling was going down. The sterling area holdings alone were roughly 5 times Britain's total reserves. If even a fraction of those holders moved at once, the $2.80 peg was gone that week. Macmillan told Eden exactly this. Britain's reserves could not survive the devaluation that would follow if the Americans sold, and within weeks of such a move the country would not be able to pay for enough food and fuel to import. That is the whole weapon. A statement of intent to sell from a creditor, communicated privately. And here's the detail that makes the American position genuinely interesting rather than simply ruthless. Washington did not actually want sterling to collapse. There is a Treasury paper from the 26th of November, 1956, titled, in effect, The American Stake in Avoiding a British Financial Crisis. It runs through the position with considerable alarm. It notes the strain on British reserves, notes that the trouble predated Suez, and then works through what a loss of confidence would mean. It observes that if confidence went, perhaps half of the sterling balances held by foreign countries and dependent territories, then standing at just under $10 billion in London, could become active claims. It notes that the Bank of England would have the greatest difficulty redeeming its liabilities all at once, and it worries specifically about newly independent countries suddenly finding their reserves worthless and looking elsewhere for support, which, in the language of 1956, meant looking toward Moscow. So the Americans were holding a weapon they had strong reasons not to fire. A sterling collapse would have damaged the entire Bretton Woods system that the dollar sat at the center of, destabilized a dozen countries that Washington was trying to keep in the Western camp, and wrecked the finances of its most important military ally at the height of the Cold War, which is exactly why the threat had to remain a threat. The bond sales were prepared and never executed. The IMF drawing was delayed and then granted in full within weeks. What Eisenhower needed was not a British financial collapse. It was a British withdrawal, achieved by making a collapse look imminent for about 8 days. That is a considerably more sophisticated operation than simply squeezing an ally, and it worked because the British could not tell the difference between a creditor who would pull the trigger and a creditor who merely needed them to believe it. There is a genuine historical argument about how decisive the money was, and I want to give it properly rather than skip past it. Macmillan himself, writing years later, denied that the reserves were the reason for the ceasefire. He said the falling away of reserves was not in itself calamitous, and that this was not why Britain accepted the ceasefire. Some historians have described the financial factors as decisive, but not the only factor. One Bank of England historian even suggested that the best way to have restored confidence in sterling would have been to push on and take the canal. And there were other pressures, which were real. World opinion had turned hard against Britain at the United Nations. There were large protests at home, and the cabinet was not united. The Soviet Union, in the middle of crushing the Hungarian uprising, issued threats about intervening and about attacks on London and Paris. And while nobody in Washington or London took them entirely at face value, they raised the temperature enormously. The Canadians and much of the Commonwealth were appalled. Eden's own health was collapsing, so the honest position is that the money was not the only thing. But I would make 2 points against the deflationary reading. The first is that Macmillan had every reason to say what he said. He became prime minister 2 months later. A chancellor who admits he lost a war because he ran out of dollars on his watch is not writing a flattering memoir. And Eden's own account describes Humphrey making it clear that the United States would not extend help or support until a definite statement of withdrawal had been made. The second is about timing, which is not really disputable. The pressure had been building for months. The Soviet threats came on the 5th of November. The ceasefire announcement came on the 6th, the same day the IMF answer arrived during the cabinet meeting, with the military objective within a day's reach. And then Britain did not merely stop, it withdrew entirely by the 22nd of December, having gained nothing at all. Macmillan was famously described within his own government as having been first in and first out on Suez. He had been among the most hawkish voices in the summer, and he was the one urging the ceasefire in November. Between those two positions, the thing that changed most measurably was the reserve figure on his desk. The proof, though, is not in the argument about motives. It is in what happened the moment Britain complied. Because the money came back, and it came back fast. Britain announced the withdrawal on the 3rd of December. The IMF drawing went through. Britain drew $561 million, with an additional standby arrangement negotiated worth up to $739 million. That drawing represented 100% of the British quota, and it was around 4 times the size of any drawing any nation had ever made from the fund. It was also, notably, the first time the IMF had extended a standby specifically to help a country fight off a speculative attack on its currency. Then, in February 1957, the Export-Import Bank of the United States extended Britain a secured credit of $500 million at 4.5%. And the oil moved. During the crisis, with the canal blocked by ships the Egyptians had sunk and the Iraqi pipelines sabotaged, the United States had held back the emergency plan to supply Europe with oil from the Western Hemisphere. Once Britain committed to withdrawal, that plan was activated. Britain still had petrol rationing from December 1956 until May 1957, but the supply came. So set the 2 months side by side. In November, an ally at war cannot access its own quota at the fund. In December and February, the same ally, having surrendered, receives the largest drawing in the fund's history, a standby facility, a $500 million credit, and an oil lift. Nothing about Britain's underlying economy changed between those 2 moments. British trade was in surplus through 1956 and 1957. The country was never insolvent. It was illiquid, at a fixed exchange rate, in front of an audience. The only variable was compliance. Anthony Eden went on medical leave shortly after the ceasefire and resigned in January 1957, less than 2 years into the job. Harold Macmillan, the man who had asked for the ceasefire, replaced him. The way that transition happened is worth a moment because it was visible to the Americans in real time, and the record of it is quietly devastating. On the 19th of November, less than a fortnight after the ceasefire, the American ambassador in London cabled Washington after a private evening meeting with Macmillan. The report is blunt. Eden had suffered a physical breakdown, would have to go on leave immediately, and this would lead to his retirement. The government would be run by a triumvirate in the meantime. The ambassador even speculated, correctly as it turned out, that Macmillan might end up as prime minister. So the United States knew that the British prime minister was finished, and knew who was likely to replace him, before most of the British cabinet did. Eden went to Jamaica to recover. He came back on the 23rd of November to a party that had lost confidence in him and a country that had lost an argument, and he was gone by January. He spent the rest of his life maintaining that the operation had been right and had been stopped too soon, and Egypt kept the canal. That outcome deserves a moment on its own because it is the part that turns a British disaster into a regional turning point. Nasser had lost the war. His air force was destroyed on the ground. His army was outclassed in Sinai, and the invading powers had taken Port Said and were rolling down the canal when they stopped. On any military accounting, he had been beaten comprehensively. He emerged as the most powerful man in the Arab world. Because what people across the region saw was not the battlefield. They saw an Egyptian leader nationalize an asset that Europeans had held for 87 years, get attacked by 2 colonial powers in Israel simultaneously, and still be in office a month later with a canal in Egyptian hands. The intended lesson had been that a nationalist could be removed. The delivered lesson was that he could not. Egyptian sovereignty over the canal was never seriously challenged again. The Suez Canal Company was gone permanently. Nasser's pan-Arab standing rose enormously, which fed directly into the union with Syria in 1958 and into the overthrow of the Iraqi monarchy the same year, one of the last major pro-British regimes in the region. And the Soviet Union, which had contributed nothing to the outcome beyond some late threats issued while its own tanks were in Budapest, collected the credit anyway. Moscow financed the Aswan Dam. The exact project whose withdrawn funding had triggered the nationalization in the first place was built with Soviet money and Soviet engineers and opened in 1970. Eisenhower had warned that a Western attack would push the Arab world toward Moscow. He was right, and stopping the attack after 8 days did not undo it. If you're getting something out of this, hit subscribe, because the last section is about what this actually cost, and it is not what the phrase end of empire usually implies. Let me put the other case first, because there is a strong argument that Suez changed less than everybody says. The empire was already going. India, the thing that had made the whole enterprise make sense, had been independent for 9 years before Suez. Burma and Ceylon were gone. The 1948 Malayan emergency and the Mau Mau insurgency in Kenya had already demonstrated the cost of holding territory against organized resistance. Ghana became independent in March 1957, 5 months after Suez, on a timetable set well before it. Decolonization was a wave with many causes, and it would have arrived without a canal crisis. There's also a reasonable argument that the financial vulnerability was self-imposed, and therefore not really an American weapon at all. Britain could have devalued. It could have floated. Countries do this. If London had been willing to accept a lower pound, American pressure would have been survivable, and the campaign could probably have been finished. What made the threat lethal was a British political choice to treat the exchange rate as an article of national identity. And there is a case for the American conduct, which does not usually get made. Eisenhower had spent months telling Britain not to do this. He was lied to by his closest ally in the final weeks of his own re-election campaign. In the same days, the Soviets were crushing Hungary in front of the world. The invasion destroyed any Western claim to the moral high ground at the exact moment it was most needed. He also, correctly, judged that a colonial-style attack would push Arab states toward Moscow, which is precisely what happened. From where he sat, stopping it fast was not vindictiveness. It was damage control, and using money instead of soldiers was the least violent tool available. All of that is fair, and none of it touches the specific thing that Suez established, which was not that the empire would end, but how it would be governed while it did. Here is what actually changed. Before November 1956, British governments believed they could act independently in the world and inform Washington afterwards. That belief had been questionable for a decade, and it had never been tested to destruction. Suez tested it. The answer came back in 8 days, and the answer was no. What made it so complete is that there was nothing to appeal to. If the United States had sent a fleet, or issued an ultimatum, or vetoed something at the Security Council, Britain could have argued, delayed, invoked the alliance, appealed to public opinion. You cannot argue with a creditor declining to roll over a position. There is no forum. There is no counterparty obligation. A holder of your paper is entitled to sell it, and a lender is entitled not to lend, and neither decision requires an explanation or admits a reply. That is why financial leverage is so much more absolute than military leverage when the target is dependent. Military pressure invites resistance and produces heroes. Financial pressure produces an accounting problem, and accounting problems are settled quietly by men in rooms who then say the decision was made for other reasons. And notice who never appears in the story. Britain was defeated in November 1956, and there was no battle. There is no surrender document, no signing ceremony, no photograph. There is a telephone call to New York that gets referred to Washington, a message delivered into a cabinet meeting, and a chancellor telling a prime minister that the reserves will not take it. The last chapter closes the circle, and it comes back to those sterling balances. The bloc did not survive. Suez had shown every holder of sterling on earth that the pound could be broken by a decision taken outside London, and holders adjusted, slowly and without announcement. Newly independent countries ran down their balances. India's sterling holdings fell to about a fifth of their 1956 level over the following decade. African colonies drew down their holdings as they became independent between 1957 and 1965, and a note in the record from the period observes that Indian distrust of sterling grew in 1956 specifically, when Britain blocked Egyptian sterling balances during the crisis, which had told every other holder exactly what their deposits were worth in a political emergency. Sterling was devalued in 1967 anyway, the thing Macmillan had refused to contemplate. And in 1972, Britain abandoned the fixed rate entirely and effectively wound up the sterling area. The arrangement that Eden's government had preserved its reserves to defend, and had accepted a national humiliation rather than abandon, was gone within 16 years regardless. Which leaves the question of what Britain actually bought on the 6th of November 1956, when it stopped a successful military operation a day short of its objective in order to protect a currency peg. It bought 15 more years of a monetary arrangement whose entire value was the impression that Britain was still a first-rank power. The impression was what was being defended, and it had been destroyed by the very act of defending it because everyone watching now knew the price. An empire that had been assembled over 3 centuries with ships and companies and treaties, and force ended, in the end, the way a leveraged position ends. Not with a defeat, but with a margin call from a creditor, who had simply decided not to extend the line. If you want to see the same instrument turned on a country that tried to write its own terms, watch our video on Chile in 1973, where the credit lines closed one at a time and nobody ever had to announce a thing.